What is going on, guys? Welcome back. In today's video, we're going to talk about whether you should use Linux as a programmer or not. So let us get right into it.
It's not a game, it's a rage thing.
Now, when it comes to the topic of Windows versus Linux, people like to get very ideological and emotional. They like to pick one side and shoot against the other side. They like to highlight their own pros and highlight the cons of the other side. What I want to do in this video is I want to give you a little bit more of a balanced opinion. So it's still going to be subjective. It's still going to be my opinion. Maybe I'm not going to consider all the points that you would consider. However, I'm going to try to highlight the pros and cons of using Linux as your main operating system and using Windows or something else. Actually, I'm not going to talk about Mac because I don't have a lot of experience with Mac, but I'm going to talk about using Linux and not using Linux, pros and cons. I also want to mention that this video is going to be about using Linux as your main desktop operating system. If you want to know if you should learn about Linux in general or use Linux in general, the answer is a clear yes. A lot of systems on this planet are powered by Linux. I'm talking about Android, I'm talking about most of the servers out there, about supercomputers. Linux is everywhere, so you should know as a good programmer how to navigate through the Linux file system, how to use the terminal. You should know your way around Linux. You should be comfortable using Linux. This video is about using Linux as your main desktop operating system as a programmer. All right, so let's get started with the pros. The first thing I want to talk about is that Linux is open source. And this has a lot of different side effects. One of the side effects is that Linux is free. And when I talk about Linux, by the way, I'm talking about the different distributions. So Mint, Ubuntu, Fedora, Manjaro, Arch Linux, and so on. We're talking about the individual distributions. They are open source, they are free. Now, there are some commercial distributions where you have to pay for maintenance, support, and so on. But most of the time, Linux is going to cost you $0, 0 cents. And you have a transparent operating system. You can look into the code, you can trust the system. Of course, you need to understand C, you need to understand C++ and assembly and all the other languages that are used in order to build the system. But if you understand it, you can look into it. Other people can look into it. You can contribute to it. And Linux is not only free in terms of money or in terms of cost, it's also free in terms of freedom. So if you're one of those people that only want to use free software unless it's necessary, for example, for proprietary drivers and so on, Linux is open source. And if you like that philosophy of open source, you definitely have to use Linux because Windows is not open source and Mac is not open source. And besides that, again, it doesn't cost anything. You can look into the system, you can trust it. Now you can try to trust Windows if you want to, but you have to take the word for granted. You cannot look into their source code. So with Linux, you can look into the source code, you can contribute to the project, and you don't have to pay money for 99.9% of the distributions. And this brings us directly to the second point, which is privacy. If you're using a Linux system, you have the maximum level of privacy that you can have. Of course, provided that you set it up properly, but on Windows, you cannot know what the system is doing. First of all, the default settings for privacy and what you share with Microsoft, same for Apple, by the way, I guess, is that you basically share most of the stuff that you're doing with the respective company, whereas in Linux, you can choose, and by default, you don't share a lot. And second of all, if you opt out in Microsoft or in Windows, basically, or if you opt out on a Mac system, you have to believe the company that they're actually not tracking you. So you can say, I don't want you to track me, but you have no way to guarantee that they're not tracking you. Now, I'm not saying that they are tracking you, but I'm saying that you cannot guarantee that they're not. In Linux, since it's open source, you can see what the system is doing, provided that you have enough skills and knowledge to understand the code or that you trust the developer community. But essentially, when you're using Linux, when you set it up properly, you have the maximum level of privacy that you can have. Now, the third point is a little bit more difficult to make. It's a little bit more tricky and controversial, and it is that Linux is more secure than Windows. Now, this is obviously a very overly generalized and overly simplified statement. We cannot say that Linux is always more secure than Windows just by nature, but we're going to talk about the different reasons for why people think that Linux is more secure than Windows most of the time and why I believe that to be true as well. And first of all, the desktop user base of Linux users is very, very small. So most desktop users are running either Windows or Mac. And this, of course, means that when hackers come up with new viruses, new spyware and exploits, they're usually going to target Windows systems and Mac systems when attacking desktop users. So if they're not attacking servers, but the ordinary desktop user, they're usually going to target Windows and Mac. So usually Linux is not the most attractive target. And this is also true because the average Linux user is more tech savvy and more security aware. So the average Linux user is not someone who opens their mail and clicks on every link that some random email sends to them. It's not the guy who is usually careless when it comes to security. So the Linux desktop user is a very unattractive target. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that there are no viruses or any exploits for Linux systems. There are plenty. But just as a general rule, as a Linux desktop user, you're not very attractive as a target for hackers. However, what I think is more important is that Linux has the security principle of open design. And this is, of course, based on the fact that Linux is open source. And intuitively, this might seem like something that is bad for security because everyone can look into the source code, everyone can try to find vulnerabilities and then exploit those. However, the good thing is that most programmers are quote unquote good and ethical. So when they find a vulnerability, they're going to report it, they're going to fix it, and the whole community is basically watching the code all the time. So it's very hard to find a vulnerability that was not found yet. And because of that, open design is usually considered to be a security principle that is good for security. Next up, we have probably one of the biggest reasons for why most people use Linux, and this is customizability. With your Linux system, you can do whatever you want. You can hyper optimize it to your specific needs. You can make it 100% the system that you want to have. And I'm not talking about manipulating the source code. I'm not talking about coding your own system. You can install different desktop environments, window managers, terminals, terminal emulators. You can do whatever you want. You can configure themes and sounds and whatever you want. You can make your Linux to look like Windows if you want. You can make it look like Mac. You can literally do everything. Since it's open source, of course, you can also change the code and the functionality. But even if you don't want to code your system yourself, you can use a distribution like Arch Linux, where basically you set up your system yourself. The only thing that is given is basically the package manager. You have to use Pacman on Arch, for example. And that's it. Everything else can be installed manually. You can choose LXDE, you can choose XFCE, you can choose i3 Window Manager, Xmonad, and so on. You can customize your system 100%. Now, of course, it's important to understand here that this, of course, is very prone to errors. You can mess up things easily. You have to spend a lot of time, especially if you choose to use something like Arch Linux. But of course, you don't have to do it. You can also just install Ubuntu, change a couple of things about the theme, and then just use it. So you don't have to customize it. But if you're someone who likes to optimize everything, shortcuts, and basically have everything 100% suited to your specific needs and tasks, you can do that with Linux. You cannot do that at such a level with Mac or Windows. Another reason to use Linux as your main operating system as a programmer is the powerful terminal and the powerful programming tools. Now, we all know that Linux has some issues with compatibility when it comes to gaming and Office and design, and we're going to talk about that. But when it comes to programming tools, it's usually the other way around. You have some compatibility issues on Windows usually. So if you're looking for some programming tools, for some stuff, some terminal tools that you need for compilation or for any other task basically, you're more likely to find it natively and easy to install on Linux, and you're going to have more difficulties getting it to run on Windows. This is just a general thing. Besides that, obviously the Linux terminal is extremely powerful. You don't have to leave it. Basically, you have an editor in there. You can install packages. You can upgrade your system through the terminal. You don't need to use graphical user interfaces for most things. Maybe you need a web browser and some recording software if you're making YouTube videos like I am. But for the most part, you don't need to get out of your terminal. You can basically live in your terminal on Linux. And of course, for programmers, this is very useful because a lot of the stuff that we do is happening on the terminal. And on Windows, the CMD is very weak and the PowerShell is probably very powerful. I have to say, I'm not very experienced with PowerShell, but for most people, I know it's very unattractive to use PowerShell. Now, of course, this is not a judgment on PowerShell's efficiency or effectivity or how good it is, but most people just don't want to learn about PowerShell unless they want to become a Windows Power user. But the Linux terminal is awesome, powerful, and fun to use. There are a lot of different tools. And when it comes to developer tools, you have a lot of compatibility with Linux, less so on Windows, in my opinion. Unless, of course, you're talking about .NET and C# and all that. But yeah, and of course, if you're using Arch Linux, you have this wonderful Arch user repository, the AUR, and there you have countless tools that are that you can recompile yourself, and this is a wonderful thing on Linux. Now we get to something that I think is very important, and this is full control over the system. With Linux, you have full control over the system. Obviously, because it's open source, but just in general, Linux doesn't force you to do updates. Linux doesn't force you to restart. Linux doesn't do anything that you don't want it to do. If you set it up correctly, and of course you need time and skill for that. But if you set up your Linux system properly, it is yours. It does exactly what you want it to do. If something doesn't work, it's usually because you didn't set it up properly, because you caused some errors. On Windows, it updates stuff, it restarts, it shuts down, it does whatever it wants. And even if you set it up properly, it still does what it wants most of the time. So with Linux, you have 100% control over your system. Now, another very good thing about Linux is that it revives old hardware. And this is maybe not a thing that you want to consider when you're talking about your main desktop operating system, but maybe you have an old computer, maybe you have an old laptop that is running on a single core CPU, and maybe you have 1 gig of RAM, and Windows XP is no longer a thing, Windows 7 is no longer a thing, there's no support, and you want to revive this old hardware. You can do that with Linux. There are many lightweight distros like Lubuntu, for example, that make your old devices useful again. And maybe you want to have a second desktop operating system or a second desktop computer system. Maybe you want to set it up for someone else. And the best way to do that, if you want to use a more lightweight system, is to use Linux and not Windows. Now, the last point I want to make here is a little bit more of a meme or a little bit more of a joke. And for this, I'm going to turn around my cap. But Linux gives you a street credibility amongst programmers, especially if you can say something like, I use Arch, by the way. Generally speaking, if you are using Linux as your main desktop operating system, people are going to think of you as a better programmer, as more experienced with computers, even if that's not the case. So that's a nice thing to have on the side. Of course, this should not be the main factor when you make your decision. Now let us get to the part where we talk about why using Linux as your main desktop operating system can be problematic. And the first thing we're going to talk about is probably the most important thing, compatibility. Linux has a big problem with compatibility, especially when it comes to gaming, especially when it comes to cutting-edge drivers for exotic hardware, especially when it comes to Microsoft Office, and especially when it comes to Adobe products. In general, if you want to have the comfort of knowing that your system is going to be able to handle new hardware, new software, the latest games, and all that stuff, you cannot use Linux. You have to use Windows because that's the only system that guarantees that it's the best choice when it comes to that. Of course, developer tools we already talked about. Linux is a little bit better, but when it comes to gaming, video editing software, design software, everything basically, and of course modern hardware, NVIDIA especially, Windows is just a better choice. You're going to be able to run these things on Windows without a hassle. Now, of course, on Linux, we have Wine, we have Play on Linux, we have Lutris, we have ProtonDB, and so on. The problem is that most of the stuff still doesn't work the same way it would work on Windows. And even if it works, it's going to be very painful and difficult to set it up. So in order to get some games to run, you're going to have to use a lot of different configs and tools, and then it's not going to run as smooth as on Windows. Sometimes it's not going to run at all. So if you're depending on Microsoft Office, if you want to be able to play most of the games or all of the games, and if you're using Adobe Suite or any exotic hardware, you cannot use Linux as your main desktop operating system. You have to go with Windows. Now, the second point I want to make against Linux is that Linux is very painful to use sometimes, and especially so for beginners. Linux is very customizable and geeky, but this comes at a price, and the price is that Linux is difficult to use, and sometimes even the most basic stuff like having multiple monitors or plugging in a new device that it doesn't know that is compatible. But even if it is compatible, even if something is a very basic thing like installing a driver, mounting something, unmounting something, having a basic mundane problem, if you're encountering it for the first time, it's going to take you a lot of time to solve it. You're going to have to browse through different forums. You're going to have to solve it yourself using the terminal. I'm not saying that this is a bad thing necessarily, because it makes you a better computer scientist, a better computer user. However, if you just want to have a system that you can boot up and use without a lot of problems, and if problems occur, you don't have to try some geeky solutions in some geeky forums, then maybe Linux is not the best choice, because Linux has a steep learning curve. In the beginning, everything is going to be difficult. Want to try multiple monitors? It's going to take some time. You're not just going to plug it in and run. You're not just going to slide in a CD, or you're not going to go and download some driver and that's it. You're going to have to use the terminal. You're going to have to try different configurations. You're going to have to change config files manually, especially if you're using something like Arch Linux, obviously, but even if you're using Ubuntu or a more mainstream distribution, you're still going to have this frustrating doing everything yourself, it's going to take just a lot of time. Let's put it that way. You're going to have to invest a lot of time in order to be comfortable using Linux, especially in the beginning, but also later on, you're going to always have to deal with the problems that you're going to have to solve yourself using the command line and forums. Now, the third point I want to make is not necessarily against Linux, it's more for Microsoft. I think Linux basically has these two cons. It's bad when it comes to compatibility, and it's difficult to use. Those are the two cons. I don't think that Linux has a lot of cons. I think that these two cons are very important, especially the first one. And because of that, I think the third point might make Linux a little bit less attractive because Microsoft is becoming more attractive. And my point here is that Microsoft is becoming more developer friendly over time. They introduce a lot of interesting stuff. The .NET Core environment, VS Code is a good tool, even though it's platform independent. You have the Windows subsystem for Linux. They're working on this all the time. So I don't want to even talk about specific examples here. Just as a feeling, as a subjective feeling, I think that Microsoft is doing more and more to become more developer friendly. I don't think that Windows is as bad for developers as it was some time ago, especially with the Windows subsystem for Linux. They're making it more and more attractive for developers to stay on Windows and not move to Linux because they're becoming more developer friendly. So let us get to the conclusion. Should you use Linux as your main desktop operating system or not? And the only right answer here is obviously it depends. You have to ask yourself certain questions. Is there any Windows-only software that you're depending on? Are you depending on the Adobe suite? Are you depending on Microsoft Office? Are you using your computer for gaming a lot? Do you want to play the latest games? Do you use a lot of exotic hardware? Those are questions that are going to determine that. Of course, also, are you ready to invest a lot of time into troubleshooting and learning about Linux in order to be comfortable using it? Are you interested in dealing with technical details? Do you want to have a lot of power over your system? Do you want to be able to customize everything? Is that something that interests you? Do you care about open source and free software? Is the Windows subsystem for Linux sufficient for your needs because you only need a powerful terminal? Is a Linux VM sufficient for your needs? And of course, the other way around, if you are on Linux, is the Windows virtual machine sufficient? Because in the Windows virtual machine, you can use Microsoft Office, for example. Are they enough? Do you want a dual boot? Do you not want a dual boot? Now, what I can say here in the end is definitely learn Linux. You have to know your way around the Linux system. So if you have just one computer, set up a virtual machine, learn about Linux, play around with it, learn about the terminal. If you have a second computer, set up Linux there, play around with it, maybe do dual boot if you want to. Definitely install the Windows subsystem for Linux on Windows. I have a video on that. Where I show you how to do that. Then you're going to be able to compile Kivy to Android, for example, which you're not able to do on Windows just like that. So I would definitely recommend you to learn about Linux, to use Linux, and to install the Windows subsystem for Linux, no matter what your conclusion is. And of course, for old hardware, Linux is the only thing that you can actually use. So that's basically it. You have to make a decision, of course, yourself. I'm not going to say yes or no here, but I would say that if you don't need Microsoft Office, if you're perfectly fine using LibreOffice, if you're fine using GIMP and all these things, if you're not a gamer, if you are satisfied with open source software and with the software that is compatible with Linux, sure, go for Linux because Linux is more developer friendly. However, I can tell you from myself, I am using Windows as my main operating system. And I would like to use Linux. I think Linux is more developer friendly. I think Linux is cooler to use. I like customizations. I have a second laptop where I have Ubuntu. I have a third laptop where I have Arch Linux installed. I like using them. But for me, for writing books with Word, for recording videos, I mean, OBS is platform independent. But for a lot of stuff, I just need Windows only software, or Windows is just running better. I want to save a lot of time troubleshooting, especially on my main system, and because of that I'm using Windows as my main operating system, even though I'm not a gamer. So I don't need the compatibility for games, I need the compatibility for things to just work. I don't want to buy a new piece of hardware like a webcam, for example, and have to deal with the issues on Linux because I don't have so much time at the moment. Maybe in the future, if Linux is getting better and better in terms of compatibility, I'm going to make the switch. I definitely use Linux on my two other computers quite a lot, but for my main computer, I use Windows because it's just more comfortable, to be honest. However, I also need to say, I don't know if I would switch to Windows if I was already used to Linux. So I also have this bias that I have been using Windows for most of my life, and I have never used Linux for a long time as my main operating system. So let me know in the comment section down below what is going to be your decision, what is your conclusion. Do you use Linux as your main operating system? Do you dual boot? Do you have virtual machine? Do you have multiple machines with Windows and Linux? Are you a Mac user? I didn't talk a lot about Mac because I don't have any experience here. Let me know in the comment section down below if you're going to switch to Linux, if you're going to switch to Windows maybe because you had some problem with Linux. Let me know and we're going to talk about that. So that's it for today's video. Hope you enjoyed and hope you learned something. If so, let me know by hitting a like button and leaving a comment in the comment section down below. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell to not miss a single future video for free. Other than that, thank you very much for watching. See you in the next video and bye.